Hey everybody, welcome on our channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the avatar of the gods and got harem? Part 2. If you are new on the channel, don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video too. So without wasting any more time, let's start the story. In hindsight, getting Azula banished wasn't exactly intentional at the time. I never even once considered the repercussions. It wasn't as though I would actually banish her for losing to me to begin with, or so I had thought in my ignorance. No one could be that much of a royal flaming, right? Turns out I was wrong. Azula had already been well on her way to being banished after I'd shown her mercy back in Kyoshi. It seems the one thing the Fire Nation despises more than losing is mercy. The twisted little stunt we pulled by impersonating her and her guards in the first place just hastened the pace a little, I guess. But I digress. Turns out Haru decided to travel with us, after all. Something about wanting to prevent the Fire Nation from ever destroying a family like his again. Kid's got spunk, I'll give him that. His folks were all for it, said he had a destiny and it would be better served by traveling with us. So now, against all odds, we've got us an earthbender. Not much of a teacher though, so I still need to find someone to train on. Ong wanted to double back to Amashu for that very reason. Thankfully cooler heads prevailed and we were able to make him realize doing so now would only prove to be a waste of time. Didn't stop him from asking Haru to show him a few things, though. I state once again, the boy is no master. I've still got the bruise from that last boulder to prove it. Nevertheless, our little family is growing. I only hope Appa can keep carrying all of us without wearing himself out. If this keeps up, we're going to need another bison. Back then, I had time for humor. And why not, I say. We'd lost Zuko, and unless Azula allied with him, not bloody likely. We wouldn't have worry about brother or sister for some time. I had no way of knowing fate was coming around to bite me in the face for all the chaos I was causing. That was when it happened. Naruto took one look at Sokka, saw his expression, and swerved his head to look back at the clouds. Why was it that everyone saw fit to interrupt his meditations? Realizing he wouldn't have any peace until Sokka had his say, the last shinobi reluctantly rounded on the young water tribe warrior to see what he had to say. Sokka was looking at him most strangely, his body tense, expression pensive. Naruto adopted a curious facade of his own, wondering what might have perturbed his friend so. Now we've got an earthbender. The boy ventured hesitantly. Naruto's gaze slipped to Haru, peaceably levitating a few pebbles in his right hand, turning them end over end, relentlessly. Rescuing his mother and father had worked wonders for the boy's self-confidence, but even here in the clouds, he preferred to keep to himself, speaking only when spoken to. Yes, it would seem so. Just wondering, but are we going to pick up a firebender, too? The FFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFffffff It would have sailed over the edge, but Katara simply waterbended it back into his cup. The young avatar shot his friend a quick and grateful glance, followed by a series of sheepish chuckles from the others at his predicament. Tsuki herself managed to keep a grip on her teacup. Naruto refused to say where he'd procured all this gear from, but at the mention of firebending, even her normally sunny disposition darkened. Yeah, what are we going to do about that? As much as I hate to admit it, Sokka has a point. Hey. Tsuki's right. Katara agreed. We might be able to find Ong a teacher for water and earth, but still has to learn Master Fire, doesn't he? There was a silence as Team Avatar mulled it over. I think Azula or Zuko would make a fine teacher. Naruto suggested. Or maybe Iroh. Ong nearly spat out his tea again. The blonde didn't take too kindly to that. Oi, he sighed as Katara once more waterbent the liquid back into the cup. I went to all the trouble of making that way up here, you know, and it ain't easy. Show some appreciation, Ong. Sorry. After being pursued by a small army of firebenders after their wildly successful jailbreak, Team Avatar was currently traveling over water once more, taking a much-needed opportunity to recuperate from their successful attack and subsequent escape until they reached land once more. Even now they could see it, a patch of earthy green and brown, growing steadily larger in the distance. But for now there was only the open ocean under their feet, the salty smell of the sea, and cries of seagulls flitting past. Now, even those birds seemed to fall silent as Naruto's words truly sank in. You can't be serious. Finally, Haru found his voice. Putting your friendship with the Dragon of the West aside, there are enemies. Why would they want to help us? At Naruto's glower, the poor bender nearly fell to pieces right then and there, faltering beneath his teacher's scrutiny. Prince Zuko, he began. Currently exiled prince. I know. He had the good grace to at least appear chastised at Naruto's caustic remark. But that's just it. He's a prince, former or not. And I doubt Azula would be willing to teach Ong anything after the stunt we just pulled back in my hometown. If anything, she probably wants to kill you even more if she still thinks you're the Avatar. In fact, I wouldn't put it past her to get at you through us. No offense, Sifu Naruto, but I think she just enjoys hurting people. There was a moment of quiet killer intent in which everyone could feel all of their inner fears coming true. Despite having only met the mad girl once, Naruto had made them well aware of her methods. If she could hurt him through them, if she could get to him by causing one of them pain, he'd do more than just defeat the princess. He'd obliterate the entire Fire Nation itself. Finally, when it seemed that they would be suffocated by his anger at any moment, the blonde spoke up to quell those fears. "Eru, Suki, Ong," he drawled, his visage turning stern. "Come here. All three of you." As they looked on, he placed a thumb in his mouth and bit down. Hard. Blood gushed forth from the wound, dribbling down his arms to form a small scrawl of kanji upon his left bicep. "Your hand." "Leave it," came the reply. "I need it to mark you guys." Momo squeaked as Naruto pressed his still bleeding thumb to the lemur's forehead. When it came away, there was a small, but unreadable kanji imprinted there. "What is that?" Suki wondered aloud. "It's called the Harem," Naruto answered, tracing the kanji into Haru's shoulder. "It allows me to teleport to a place or person I've marked in the past. Sokka and Katara already have it." He did not wilt in the slightest at their admonishing glances. "It was necessary. Before he left, your father asked a favor of me. He told me to protect you. The both of you. Placing the Harem on you just seemed natural at the time. How else was I to keep you safe? Besides, Sokka's mark is just between his shoulder blades, he'd never have known about it otherwise." Katara opened her mouth to protest, only to snap it shut as something occurred to her. Naruto noticed. "Something wrong, Katara." "Where?" Her voice was little more than a tiny squeak. "Did you mark me?" "Where?" "I said, where did you mark me?" Naruto just stared at her and began laughing. "It's not funny," she told him. "Yes, it is," he howled. "Only you would think I'd do something like that." After finally managing to calm down, he looked back at Katara, suddenly aware of the deft motions of her hands. "Wait a second, what are you doing with that water, Arg?" He barely had time to finish with that sentence before water spewed up and out of her pouch, sending him flying off Appa and to his death miles below. Or, so everyone thought. 7 seconds passed after he toppled over the edge. 7 seconds of agonizing silence. Still, no one made any effort to retrieve the fallen blonde. Suki began to fret. She knew Naruto's body was near immortal, but even so, a fall into the ocean from this height might well spell his doom. The last thing she wanted was for her precious teacher, the boy whom she'd begun to feel for, fall to his doom so early in their journey. Fearing what she would find, the Kyoshi warrior peered over the edge. All she saw was a few Naruto-sized impressions in the clouds below, a sure sign that it had been a fast and furious fall to the water below. What if he was hurt? What if? Ong was only a split second faster than her, springing to his feet, light as a breeze, ready to hurl himself out into oblivion after his friend. "We have to go get him." "Relax, Arrowhead," Sokka soothed. "Sifu's fine." Suki was inclined to agree. But shouldn't we do something?" "Nah," the warrior went back to sharpening his boomerang. "Give him a few seconds." "Are you sure?" "He's right." Katara seconded, leaning back in the saddle, her brief burst of anger gone, little more than a memory. If something like that could have killed Sifu, he wouldn't be here now. "Why does everyone call him that?" the young Avatar asked. "He's not your teacher, is he?" "Not anymore, no, but he did teach me a few things about bending when I was little," Katara replied. "You'd be amazed what he could do with water. I learned a few moves from him back then, too." Sokka performed a perfunctory swing with his club for added emphasis. "Naruto's a decent guy outside of battle, but when it comes to anything involving actual combat, or worse, training, he's a slave driver." "Right, Katara." Both brother and sister shuddered at some unspeakable memory. "I'm so glad he doesn't make me run laps around the South Pole anymore. Or make me waterbend for 2 days straight," Katara added with a small shiver of her own. Haru and Suki exchanged nervous glances. And then there was the one time. "Sokka. Stop." Katara cried. "We are not, under any circumstance, mentioning that to anyone, ever again." The rest of Team Avatar silently sweat-dropped. "Well, promise to teach me the shinobi arts." Suki smiled nervously. "I don't think he's that excessive. The Sedrabutlater Wantrakim." Scarce had she spoken than Naruto reappeared, his words and body roaring past the men into the sky, his abrupt ascent showering everyone with droplets at his passing. He did not look nor sound pleased at all. Suki couldn't tell whether he was wet from Katara's water or if it had anything to do with short dip in the ocean just now. Regardless, he was quite the sight, soaring through the clouds like some wayward angel, streaked in otherworldly luminance. Wait a minute. Was Naruto actually glowing? He was. Bathed in saffron light from head to toe, he was the picture of godhood. Those eerie red orbs held her, captivated her, drew her in. "I want." Her cheeks burst into furious flame seconds later as she realized what she just thought. Ah. Down, girl. Down. The Kaiashi warrior ruthlessly shook her head, desperately seeking inner peace and clarity as her teacher alighted beside her, effortlessly gliding down from the heavens to steal a place at her side. That golden glow and those eerie markings still shone from his body. Up close he looked downright intimidating within the cloak. She could see she wasn't the only one thunderstruck by the blonde's newfound appearance. Katara's mouth hung agape as well. Clearly the waterbender was just as baffled by this transformation. Honestly, he never ceased to amaze her. Watch those wandering eyes, girls. Naruto admonished, grinning. Wouldn't want to get the wrong idea. Suki was fairly certain her face was flaming, even behind. Well, Katara stuttered, recovering herself. I'm glad you're alright. Naruto's language could have melted the iron hull off a Fire Nation vessel. Thankfully, his cursing was spoken in his native tongue. Crazy girl. He finished with a hiss. I know I taught you to be ready at a moment's notice, but that was ridiculous. It's your own fault for teasing me, the brunette chided lightly. If you just told me where you'd put the seal instead of laughing, I wouldn't have overreacted. Naruto opened his mouth to reply and promptly snapped it shut. True, she did have a point, but hey, it had been so long since he'd laughed like that. Katara didn't exactly need to know about it, did she? Yet. So instead of arguing, he forced himself to relent and grin beneath her glare. Won't happen again. Looks aside, there was just something about righteous female fury that made even him wary of her when she was like this. Apparently, Sokka did not fear the female fury. He nearly fell off the saddle himself in laughter. Never would have thought he'd be afraid of Katara. What was that, Sokka? Nothing. Get back over here. Naruto said, ignoring the bickering siblings and biting his thumb for a second time. I still need to mark you. Reluctantly the young bender did as he was told, trying his utmost not to flinch in dismay when he saw that bloody digit. But why your blood? The boy asked squeamishly as the shinobi traced a symbol onto his left bicep. Is that really necessary? Naruto sighed, air drying himself with a jutsu before falling back to Appa's back. It seems clouds are made out of water after all. But, first, let's answer your question. Yes, it is necessary. Ink might wash off. My blood won't, not if I don't want it to. It'll never wash off. By using my own blood as a catalyst, the seal itself is strengthened, allowing me be able to travel farther. For example, Katara could be in the Fire Nation, and I'd still be able to reach her where I say, back home in the South Pole, for example. Although it might take me a few minutes to travel that far. Sokka thumbed at his chin. That's pretty powerful stuff. Naruto noticed Suki looking at him hopefully. Sorry, he mollified her, I'm afraid I'm the only one who can use it. In any case, it's your turn. Pick a spot. Alright. She nervously pulled back the collar of her dress, allowing him to brand her just below her neck, outfit not without a small flush. One could easily see it, even within her makeup. Naruto wisely chose not to tease the poor girl any further than he already had, and certainly not in the presence of Katara. He still wasn't entirely sure what his former student felt for him, or what the addition of Suki had done to impact what had been a stable friendship from years past. One would have thought she'd outgrown her childhood crush on him long ago, but the events of the last few weeks had recently done much to shake that rock-solid opinion. To antagonize her just wouldn't be fair. For now. Having finished the brand, the blonde clambered off the saddle and pressed his hand to Appa's furry head. The sky bison rumbled questioningly, but not before trying to reach its head around and lick him. Here you go, buddy. He soothed. Just to be safe. Wait, Aang frowned, why Appa? We rely on him to fly us everywhere. Naruto pointed out, his glare scathing. You and I might be able to fly on our own power, but if something were to happen to the owl boy, the rest of us would be up a creek without a paddle. Now, if someone ever tries to target him, I'll know of it. And if he were to be, gods forbid, captured, I'd be there to prevent it. Sound good? You've really thought of everything, haven't you? I try. Naruto yawned. Right, then. I'm going to take a nap. Suki, I want you to practice the meditation I showed you the other day, okay? Do that a couple of times and I might be able to do something about your chakra problem. Yes, Sifu. Despite himself, the one time Jinchuriki actually felt his ears burn a bit. Perhaps it was being called a teacher. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he'd never really taken on a student of his own before. In any case, he felt his cheeks warm with pride at being addressed as Sifu for the first time since coming to this land. It was nice. But it was also tiring to keep track of so many to ensure that no harm came to his little. His tasks completed for the time being, Naruto leaned back in the saddle, consigning himself to a nap. It was peaceful up here amongst the clouds, one might think. You could simply drift off without so much as a care in the world. Content to do just that, he drifted off almost immediately, lulled into peaceful slumber by the gentle breeze and the promise of doing good. That was when the nightmares came. They always seized upon him when he least expected it, preying on these moments of weakness. He saw the world as a firebender would, bathed in beautiful flames, reduced to ash by his hand. As always, a girl stood at his right, and until this very moment he hadn't been able to recognize her. Now he saw, and now he knew, just as he knew her laughter, recognized those amber eyes and ebony hair. Azula. The scene blurred, leaving him dwelling in darkness. "Murderer," a voice whispered out from the ether. "Show yourself," he demanded, squaring his jaw and facing the dark. His mind knew what he would face, but his body was another story. His legs were powerless, helpless to move, as more than 1,000 hands sprouted from the earth, latching onto his ankles and dragging him down. Blue eyes scrunched shut, refusing to look into the faces of his captors, knowing full well what he would find there. The face of Hinata, of all those he had ever loved, all his friends, family, everyone he'd ever known. All those he'd left behind in the passage of time. "Traitor," another voice hissed in his ear. "He massacred many. He betrayed his own friends. He killed his own family. One such as him should not exist. He should be put to death. He should be killed by the ones he's slain." So ensorcelled was in his nightmare that he nearly didn't notice when Ong started jostling him awake hours later. He jerked upright with a small hiss, barely strangling the scream that threatened to come tearing out of his throat and into the open air. Cold sweat slicked his skin, his heart hammering out of his chest. "Just a dream," he told himself. "Just a dream, just a dream, just a dream." "Are you alright?" Suki was suddenly there, laying a hand across his shoulder. Naruto bit back a hiss as he remembered all those palms, clawing at him, tearing at his throat. "I'm fine." "Really? Because you look like you were having a nightmare." "I am fine." At her hurt expression, his own softened. "Really, I am. It was just an old nightmare." A muscle jumped in Naruto's jaw, his temper threatening to overtake him in that instant. He bit back a growl, his blue eyes flicking towards the young avatar. "Drop it, Ong." He sighed. "I'll tell you later." "Sorry, it's just I've been thinking." HMMPH. Taking those words in stride, the former Jinchuriki reluctantly rose, shaking off the last vestiges of sleep. "And what, pray tell, were you thinking about?" The young avatar seemed to squirm beneath his gaze for what felt like an eternity before speaking. When he finally did, his words caused a pall to fall over the group. "I think someone's trailing us." Sure enough, one could see smoke behind them on the horizon, a plume of black smoke rising in the distance. Katara let out a sigh as she sat up, stating, "Let's just hope that it's not the Fire Nation. That's the last thing we need." Indeed. The silence poured into the saddle, and Naruto leaned back into the seat as he processed what he could recall from his dream. He was growing used to these visions of his, but what he'd seen had disconcerted him. Were these kids going to lose the war without his intervention? Of course not. He had every faith in them. But those images still chilled his soul. What if his interference upset the delicate balance of this land? Already he was considered the avatar by many, and doubtless his presence here would prevent many deaths, but still, what was this sense of unease he felt? And what did Azula have to do with it? Was that the fate of the world if he didn't redeem her? He pondered that matter for quite some time, the land growing steadily closer with each passing minute. Within a few minutes, they wouldn't have to worry about any attacks from sea, which meant their position would be that much more fortified against any enemy attack. Barry frowned just then, peering over the saddle. "Hey, don't look now, but I think that might be." Even as the words were being transmitted to his ears, Naruto was pressed back into the saddle by a sharp turn of Appa. Suddenly a good few of those aches and pains decided to protest their very existence from the pressure being exerted on him, even through his own mental blockade. As soon as the pressure let up, he exhaled in relief before he quickly released his chakra hold on the saddle and stood, earning a few anxious looks from his friends as he did so. The hell was that? He fumbled with the balance for a split second before sticking his feet to the saddle with chakra again, and he glanced over the edge just in time to see a massive ball of fire flash in their direction. Pressure pushed him back on his heels. Appa ascended, avoiding a direct hit but shuddering from the glancing blow of the heat nonetheless. He was jerked around on his feet a moment from a couple of turns before the smoke of an extremely large blast of flame filled his vision in close proximity. Blue flame. It was therefore only a moment before they flew past it, revealing the distinctive wedge shape of a Fire Nation vessel, its black trim cutting in an angry swathe through the ocean below just in time for another shot to whistle perilously close. "Azula." Ong finished with a gulp. Naruto groaned. "Troublesome woman." Suki managed a nervous smile. "Anyone want to bet she's still steamed about that stunt we pulled?" Sokka snorted. "Oh please, she probably doesn't even, oh my god." If it wasn't for Naruto's hold on his shirt, he was pretty sure he would be laying on the floor, but he was also pretty sure that he would be in equal amounts of pain if compared to his current situation. The furious heat raging below their position suddenly intensified, that mere candle becoming a raging flame as another blue-white fireball sizzled past. Brah. Appa bellowed in pain as a small comet seared just beneath his stomach, drawing an angry line across his hide. Naruto and Aang were up in the same instant, already moving amidst a bison's bellow. No glances were exchanged, nor were any words spoken. They already knew that their furry friend would do his best to ferry the rest of the gang to safety. It could not be said who leaped first, only that each avatar flung himself over the edge, that both hurtled towards the ship, one borne by his glider, the other by his chakra alone. "You don't have to help me, you know," Naruto shouted over the wind as they hurtled toward the flagship. "I can handle this myself." "You're just one person," Aang replied, struggling to make himself heard over the rising gale. "It'd be wrong of me to let you do all the work." "Suit yourself." Naruto cracked a crazed grin. "But if you're suggesting we make a game of this." "What?" "No, I wasn't." "Too late. Brace ya." With a massive exertion of his chakra, the blonde rocketed forward, reaching the lone ship mere moments before Aang had the chance to follow from his glider. In that moment, that brief instant of hesitation, he alighted loudly upon the prow of the ship, the sudden acceleration, creating an equally massive dent in the metal hull of the ship. He was left to take in everything in at a glance, the trebuchets, the soldiers, the firebenders in there, standing at the head of them all, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a small round O of disbelief. "Azula? You?" Every single soldier, bender or otherwise, scurried away at the sound of her voice. Azula might look compassed, with not so much as a single hair out of place, but were one to look deeper, they could easily see what had long since lurked beneath, the beginnings of madness, unearthed by this sudden shift in power. And in his experience, madmen, or madwomen in this case, were the most dangerous of all. They did not conform to any one strategy or doctrine. Naruto grinned, snuffing her flung fireball out between his fists. "So what brings you to these waters, princess? I hear the cod are quite nice this time of year." "You know damn well why I'm here, fool." Her words rose with each syllable, pitching ever higher. "I've been banished. And it's all your fault. Because you showed me mercy that day." It wasn't long until she was all but shrieking at him, cursing his very existence from the darkest depths of her soul. "Father banished me, but not because of that. Because of you he called me a traitor, accused me of liberating Earth Kingdom peasants to spite him. I'm no better than Zuzu now. No. I'm worse. Even if I were to capture you, even were I to kill you, he'd never allow me to come home. Never." "Oh, right." Naruto mused. "She probably doesn't understand that I impersonated her that day." "Well, that's rough." He shrugged, settling for a half-truth. "I wasn't aiming to get you banished when I revived you." "Why did you do that?" The sheer force of her exclamation rocked him back on his heels. I thought you'd be a bit more grateful, considering." "Maybe I was, once." Azula hissed out, flinging a bolt of lightning, only to have it redirected in her face, nearly ending her for a second time. "But not anymore. No one believes me. They all think I'm crazy. They say I'm losing my mind. But they don't know what I know in my head, Avatar. Yes, I know." She thrust a finely manicured finger at him. "You killed me. And then you brought me back. Do you have any idea of my shame? My humiliation? Bad enough to know that you'd ended my life once, but you had to bring me back for a second time. I don't understand. Was my death not good enough for you? Do you intend to make me suffer for challenging you? To humiliate me even further?" Those honey gold orbs held him. In that instant she was not a crazy fireball slinging princess, she was simply a girl demanding answers, an explanation of why she had been wronged. Naruto exhaled a long suffering sigh, pushing a hand through his matted locks. "Typical. My one act of kindness, and it backfires." "Pardon the cliché," he replied, "but I brought you back because I saw the good in you, unlike most other firebenders. You can change. You can become something more than what you are. Your dim-witted brother has that potential too, but I doubt he'll realize it anytime soon." Azula snarled, suddenly hesitant in the face of his empathy. "I am not good. You're just saying that so you can stab me in the back, like father and all the rest. Trust is overrated. Fear is the only way to ensure loyalty and I know it." "I beg to differ," Naruto argued, readying himself for another fireball. "Trust is mutual. You have to give to receive. Just as I chose to give you life again. I'd call that trust, wouldn't you?" He'd been right to ready hissile for another assault. This way the flame was nimbly avoided by jumping over the exile's head. "And what would you know of betrayal?" The former princess snarled and darted after him, trying and failing to close the gasp. "To be stabbed in the back by your own nation, having done all that they ask, day and night, without fail, only to be cast aside when you make one mistake. Do you?" Naruto broke away from her with a frown. "As a matter of fact, I know all too well the sting of betrayal." Indredibly he found himself replying, blue eyes narrowing to crimson slits. "I was betrayed by a man whom I'd thought to be my friend. He was a proud foolish sod who left our village in search of power. I tried to bring him back and failed. Instead I was forced to watch him change over the years, come to believe himself then his clan, to be better than everyone and anyone else. I tried to make him see reason over the years, tried to remind him that he still had friends. But he wanted me gone, me, my family, and all that I stood for. In the end, I had to kill him. But don't you see? He spread his arms wide in invitation. It's the reverse for you. Now that you've been banished you don't have to deal with a royal flaming asshole anymore. Whoosh. He nimbly dodged aside as another blue-black fireball whistled past his head, but he did not stop speaking. Surely you must have friends outside the Fire Nation. You have the freedom to go see them now. In fact, I dare to say you have. You shut up. Azula cried, covering her ears with both hands. I don't want to hear this. Not from you. More freedom than anyone else in the world. Shut up. The burst of flame that followed her words was nothing short of spectacular. Her fireball spanned the entire width of the ship itself. There was no way he could dodge that without jumping overboard, and if he did that, he'd be exposed to the follow-up attack. There was really only one option. Naruto simply inhaled, and her flames withered and died, reduced to mere embers on the deck. Azula's voice was little more than a whisper. But that's not fair at all. Ah, I see you've been practicing. He nudged a dark soot appraisingly with a foot. Your flames are almost black now. They'll never be quite up to snuff with my Amaterasu, but still you continue to impress. Tell me, if I were to say that you can fight me anytime, would you calm down? Assuming. Assuming what? Azula regarded him warily, half expecting an attack. And by the gods themselves, she got one. Assuming you can swim. Naruto grinned and struck down upon the deck. Once. Twice. Thrice. Each strike split steel and twine before his knuckles, reverberating through the vessel's hull with such force that he actually flipped the ship into the air and broke it in half, sending the separate halves careening away from one another, end over end, plunging the princess and her soldiers into the drink. The avatar of the god snapped off a sarcastic salute and launched himself backwards, ripping into the air patted his hands, smiling smugly down at the ship. Well, guess I'd better check up on Katara and the others. Had he tarried a moment longer, he might have seen the smaller lifeboat jettisoned forth from its remains. Had he stayed, perhaps risked a glance backwards, he might have spared himself much pain and suffering. But the avatar of the gods did not, and because he did not, things changed. And thus he left. Azula trailing in his wake. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, why the pep talk? Why spare her life twice? At the time, I'd already wrested so much away from her, at the time, I simply couldn't bear the thought of taking her life again as well. I'll have to talk to Ong about that. Kid's far too soft-hearted for his own good. If he has any say in it, he probably won't even kill the Fire Lord. Somebody needs to toughen the boy up. Might as well be me. Ah, but I'm getting off track. Why spare Azula? Why let her live and risk her causing chaos again and again, time after time? Looking back, the answer's pretty obvious to me. Guess I just have a thing for tragic souls. But when it happened, well, that changed a few things. Well, looks like I missed a few things. Naruto felt ash fill his throat as he descended to the ground as he beheld the destruction sprawled out before them. A bitter taste had swelled up upon his tongue, and not just because from the soot at their feet. It was the knowledge that the Fire Nation would commit such horrendous acts simply because they could. Some of them might be redeemable. Some, but not all. No mere forest fire could have done this. Fire Nation? He asked Sokka, expression grim. Fire Nation? What, no jokes? Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. I'm counting on you for some comedy here. Sorry man, I got nothing after seeing this. You were burned again, Suki sighed, indicating the sorry state of his cloak. I'm more concerned about Appa. It's just a graze. Katara confirmed. He'll be fine in a day or two. Well, that's good too. He broke off as he saw Ong come towards him. Why did you do that? The what, Arrowhead? He sighed as the avatar stalked closer, his expression one of righteous anger. You killed all those people on the boat when you tore it in half. Katara began, but Naruto cut her off with a hand. My dear boy, I did not kill them. He chastised, tone colder than ice itself. The ocean did that. If they can swim, they'll be fine. If they can't, then it's their own fault for attacking us. Perhaps if you grew a pair you'd learn to accept death as a natural part of life, you wouldn't be so squeamish about these things. Before the young monk could hope to continue, the blonde turned his attention elsewhere. Now, Earth boy. Come here. We have a lot of work to do if we want to restore this forest. Aye, yes sir. He bade Haru come close and together, the two of them tilled the earth, Haru with his earthbending and Naruto with his own application of raw power and ninjutsu. Within a matter of mere moments, the Ashen soil had been properly tilled, better than before. But he didn't stop there. When their work was done he shooed the young bender away and set to work himself, as only a shinobi could. "What are you going to do?" Kotaro gulped, suddenly filled with trepidation. "Naruto. This." Grunting, the blonde performed a single set of seals and clenched his hands together. "You'd be amazed by the bloodlines you gain after absorbing an all-powerful monster." Without another word he spread into a horse stance, clasped his palms, and uttered a single phrase. "Mokuton. Jukai Kentan. Wood-style deep forest emergence." With those words, he breathed life back into the forest. Literally. Roots arose from the sundered soil, spreading upward to form trunks, then branches, then entire trees themselves, their tendrils digging deep into the loamy soil. As the gong looked on, they watched the ruinated soil burning from black to a healthy shade of brown, then a deep verdant green. Before long the towering oaks began to blot out the sun itself, and yet the light still shone. Within minutes the forest was whole, or, barring that, a great deal better off than it had once been. It was a pleasant feeling, restoring what had been destroyed. Golden daggers of sunlight crept in through the branches and slashed at their eyes, unpleasantly forcing them to squint, as the forest rose around them in a sorceress of crackling branches and growing roots. Their hands before their faces, as if they still had any reason to protect them from anything anymore, Team Avatar opened their eyes, to momentarily blind themselves before Naruto's radiance. He stood there in a cradle of light, grinning from ear to ear. And then, just as suddenly as his cloak had emerged, it vanished. The trees creaked to a half around him, their leafy limbs still stretching out towards the setting sun in unspoken prayer. Sokka took a look around and whistled. "I can't believe you just did that." "Yeah, it's a bit tiring." Naruto yawned. "Creating a forest out of a single acorn. I can't believe it either." Scarce curtain of flame descended the shadows to light the newly made forest aflame. Branches went up. The gong turned to face this intruder and found themselves face to face with none other than a sopping wet Azula. She'd since lose her braid in the crash and was dripping from head to toe. And yet somehow, in spite of all this, she still managed to look absolutely terrifying. At least to the others. "Oh, was that important?" She grinned eerily. "I think that was important." Bison. Naruto ground out, eating forward. "Village. Now." "But. Now." Sokka ushered everyone onto Appa, a loud yip yip. Sent the bison soaring into the sky and toward the nearby village they'd seen from the sky earlier. Naruto didn't dare turn his back on Azula now, any chance of him prevailing and putting out this fire depended solely on his reaction time. "Sending your friends away?" She chuckled softly. "Such a shame. Your fangirls won't be able to collect your corpse." Naruto shook his head in disbelief, crazy didn't even begin to define this girl. "Look, when I said we can fight anytime, I didn't think you'd be so." The fireball silenced him, obliterating a newly born tree before he could finish. "So what now?" "Now?" Azula growled, her teeth bared. "Now it's over. You're tired from recreating that forest and you have no place to go. You can run, but I'll catch you. I may not be able to reclaim my honor by killing you, but it'll at least make me feel that much better." Naruto nearly facepalmed. "Did you listen to anything I said? You're banished. Just like Zuko. Except capturing me won't restore you." A searing line of flame across his cheek cut him off. "Don't even think about running." Azula circled him, a predator ready to pounce. "Who said anything about running?" Naruto sighed, reaching back to remove his cloak, casting the garment aside with an errant flick of his wrist. "In case you've forgotten, I've beaten you once already. Twice, if you'd like to count this afternoon." Behind Azula's pale skin, the slow flushing of her face looked almost like a growing forest fire and she seemed literally unable to catch her breath. Oh, yes. She remembered. She burned at the memory of how soundly she'd been beaten. Unthinking in her exasperation, she lashed out, flinging a fireball at him in anger. It was a mistake. Naruto simply raised a hand, Rinnegan flaring, and absorbed it. Just like that. Her blue-black flames rippled harmlessly against his unseen shield, her own power siphoned away, leaving him even stronger than before. "That wasn't very nice." "You mean I'm not good enough for you? You're hurting my feelings." "Too bad." Naruto growled. "I don't want to hear lies from you. I want the truth. Are you enjoying this? Are you sure?" Her smile had just a touch of madness to it. "I'm a pretty good liar." "It's a crying shame your fighting skills aren't as good," he retorted. "That did it. I'll show you skill." Naruto moved like water, form and volume, but shifting, changing, never in one place for more than the span of 2 beats. Never allowing her to touch him or so much as even graze him in her endless assault. His quick and clever movements infuriated Azula to no end. Had he been toying with her before? He stepped forward. So too, did something else. The spirit registered as a black and white blur between the two of them, roaring and lashing out in the time it took for both warriors to blink. Its claws sank not into their flesh, but into their spirits, violently tearing them free and casting them into each other. Even Naruto, with his super sensitive senses, only registered this much. He had the sense of being flung into something, but everything was so out of focus that he could barely try to breath, let alone think, as the universe blurred around him. Suddenly, the universe began to unblur. Naruto blinked in surprise, his world reeling, his skin numb. One moment he had been fighting Azula, and the next this. He found himself staring at himself, utterly unable to bail of what had happened. Or how it had happened. What the devil was going on here? Was he staring at a clone? But no, he hadn't created one. What was going on here? He became aware of his own shuffling footsteps, his shallow breathing, blood rushing in his ears, sweat beating upon his brow. Then he looked down, and what he saw there turned his spine to ice. Why were his hands so small? And why was he wearing armor? More importantly, why did his chest feel so damn heavy? He took a tottering step forward, suddenly aware of hair before his visage, those ebony tresses blotting out his vision for the smallest of seconds. Naruto froze. Touched a hand to his face. Then his chest. Oh no. Suddenly, a voice yelled out, "Sweet and I in holy flames," causing him to crane his neck in that direction. The forest was still burning around him, so it was difficult to properly believe what he was seeing, or if it was just the soot in his lungs. "Why are you standing there?" His body sputtered in a feminine tone, shattering all doubt. "Stop messing with my body like that." "What are you? Oh. Crap." It was Azula's voice that emerged from his mouth, albeit with a slight drawl. What he had thought was a clone was his own frightened body, staring back at him with horror and trepidation. But that wasn't him standing there. And if wasn't standing there, had he just swapped bodies with Azula? Yeah, not my finest moment. As it turned out, some crazy forest spirit, I believe Aang later told me his name was Haibai, was responsible for the two of us swapping bodies. In all likelihood, it happened because Azula tried to burn down the forest I restored. As to why I was attacked, that remains a mystery, even to me. Regardless of the who, what, when, where, why, that evening almost proved lethal for the both of us. The fire Azula had started nearly enough in its own right, but with the two of us in unfamiliar bodies, well, for most, that would have been a death sentence right then and there. It was horrible. Not only was I forced to watch as everything I'd grown burned down around me, but I had to share the experience with an irate ex-princess. Thankfully, Haibai had turned its attention to the village. This battle would be Aang's, not mine. I had problems of my own. She couldn't use any of my abilities, but I found myself beginning to get a handle on hers within an hour of exchanging bodies. Hey, when you spend a lifetime observing the finest benders in the Fire Nation long before Sozin's little stunt, mind you pick up a thing or two. There was one more perk to being trapped in her body, however. Stopped at this instant. Naruto in Azula's body paused in what he was doing, shirt poised just over his midsection, exposing the pale flesh of her stomach for all the moonlight to see. This hesitation was only momentary, however, and with a flick of the wrist, sent the soaked garment flying to join the rest in the pile. All the armor and trappings she had worn had been cast aside onto the riverbank, her boots and gloves removed, leaving the shinobi-turned-firebender clad only in a pair of battered breeches and mere moments before, the tattered remains of a shirt torn by brambles and briars. "I'm sorry, was that important?" He grinned, golden eyes flashing in the night as he hooked his thumbs in the broken waistband of her pants. "In that case, you won't mind if I..." "Stop. It's your fault we're both sopping wet to begin with," Naruto pointed out at last, slinging her, technically now his, wet clothes over a nearby branch. "We had to dive into the lake to get away from the flames, remember that? Just be thankful it didn't spread any further." He risked a pointed glance to the charred remnants of the forest, a forest he'd only just restored. "Which reminds me." "No." Azula grabbed for him, but she was still unaccustomed to this new tall, bulky body. She overreached in her attempt to stop Naruto's treacherous stripping, and in doing so, found the pants flung in her face. Her balance efficiently sundered, the former princess was sent tumbling backward to land face-first in the drink. Naruto's lilting laughter, the laughter of her body, the scoundrel, echoed after her, mocking the once proud bender for her tiny and feeble attempt to stop him. Azula growled, ripped the leathers off her face, and pushed her body back into off the shallows, propping herself up on her hands and knees. "I swear when I catch you." "Not much to catch here, darling." Azula froze as she caught sight of Naruto again. And promptly started spluttering. "Ah, you what?" Now he stood before her clad only in her undergarments, adding insult to injury, he'd even struck a pose. Were it not for that black lace bra and underwear, well, Azula didn't want to complete that thought. And then, just when she was certain matters could not prove any worse, that the fates themselves could no mock her any more than they already had. They did. "Wow, these girls are a lot bigger than I'd thought they'd be, Azula." Naruto mused, fondling them between those her delicate hands. "Nice body, too. And you're only what, 17? Gotta admit, whoa. His head dipped backwards abruptly. A heartbeat later Azula crashed into the ground, her arms closing around nothingness as the shinobi cartwheeled away with an almost effortless ease. In that instant, he almost reminded her of Ty Lee, the way he spun gracefully, deceptively delicate, then darted back towards her with sudden, straightforward power. "You've been keeping in shape, I see." He trilled pleasantly, mocking with her own voice. "I had to admit, I was a little worried about swapping bodies for a bit there, but I think this is a nice trade, don't you? I may not have any chakra to work with, but I'm nimble as ever. And you hahaha. Nice try." This time, she managed to get a handful of his hair before he escaped her large rough hands, snatching a few stray strands before he lashed up and out with his heel and struck upward. At first, Azula didn't understand what he was doing. Yes, the blow would certainly sting a little, but why was he aiming so high? Pain. That was Azula's only thought as she crumpled to the ground. Stars, whole planets detonated before her vision, leaving her blinded to all else except the pain between her legs. Naruto chuckled mirthlessly and, before the pompous princess had a much-needed chance to recover, he threw her back into the water. "Fassa first." The once proud royal gasped as water flooded her nostrils, his body floundering helplessly in the drink for a heart-stopping instant of pure terror before finally she managed to get the arms back under her control. One thought dominated her mind. Vengeance. Swift and certain. "When I get out of this, I am going to kill him." Strong hands pushed up against the riverbed, levering her head up just enough to voice her complaint followed by a mouthful of water. Anger painted her every feature, her mouth was contorted in a rictus of white-hot fury, so intense that the water itself seemed to steam off her face. That was as much as her powers seemed to amounted to in this body. Steam. Naruto was waiting for her there on the bank when she finally clambered back to the bank, legs crossed and arms folded, looking every inch the lady in her body. Hell, he'd even managed to redress himself while she'd been busy trying not to drown, having taken her hair out of the bun content to run his hair finger through the dark tresses. "Did you enjoy your bath?" he asked mildly with her voice. "Oh, you have such soft hair." This was added with grin. "I'll have to consider growing mine out sometime." Azula growled. "Bath?" she hissed, low and fierce. "Yes, I believe that's what I said." Naruto's golden eyes glittered back at her. "Then how about I give you one?" Enraged, both by her impromptu soak and what the avatar was putting her through, Azula tried to fling a fireball at him. All that emerged was a harmless puff of feeble smoke, not even the tiniest ember would obey her. Naruto looked at her for a long moment, full lips twitching in bemusment's grand gaze. Then he frowned, and his voice became like death, the same death she doled out to more than a few servants in her childhood for failing to please her. He rose from the long in one smooth movement, his now golden eyes regarding her coldly, coolly. More than one guard had been on the receiving end of that awful glare, and although it was still her face, Azula felt herself quail a bit when she looked into those hazel eyes. Then Naruto's newfound visage hardened and she realized what he was about to say, the same thing she herself had often said to those she considered to be beneath her. "I believe someone needs a lesson in humility." He stepped forward and struck like a viper, sending her sprawling back into the water with a deceptively swift swing of his heel. That was all it took. Another swing swept her visage into the muck, eliciting an impromptu shriek of surprise from her new body. Azula choked out a desperate gasping breath, rose on those quivering hands and knees, only to find her head ruthlessly taken hold of and driven back under yet again, her nose pressed up the muck of the riverbed. Her body thrashed and floundered, but even in this form, even in her body, Naruto was simply too strong for her. The more she struggled, the more it hurt, her body refusing to respond with the awesome strength he had displayed. This body had displayed during their previous clashes. It was frightening. What's going on here? Growing ever more frantic, losing oxygen with each passing second, Azula tried to call upon her bending, only to remember once more that this body lacked any sort of kai. Without it, she was as helpless as a newborn and twice as fragile. Powerless. Her strength meant nothing to her in this body. Somehow, that thought terrified her even more. Weakness was her greatest fear. Without her bending, without her agility, without any of was she, nothing. Her mind worked frantically, scrabbling for a solution, anything at all, but in her panic, she couldn't get her arms around to grapple with him, and with his knees pinning her legs. Abruptly, Naruto stood up and pulled at the last minute, freeing her from a watery grave. Azula gasped and inhaled, sweet glorious air flooding her lungs, as Naruto held her head out of the water. His visage came back into focus as she blinked the pain away from her eyes, her own face staring down at her with chilling dispassion. "Are you quite done?" His tone was light, but she could hear the steel beneath, utterly uncaring that he'd nearly drowned her in his own body. "I'll do this as many times as I have oof." His words ended in a startled grunt as Azula bucked, using her larger body to rear back and kick him in the face. Hard. To her surprise, Naruto made no move to dodge, even when the back of her boot slammed into his chin with all its might. There was a silence, the princess unable to believe she'd actually struck him, the shinobi startled to find he'd actually felt it. A trickle of blood trickled down from his mouth, trailing across a cheek and down his chin. Suddenly and without warning, Naruto's grin folded in on itself, his expression thunderous, golden eyes full of murder. He turned, spat out a tooth, clicked his jaw, and to her horror smiled. It was not a pleasant thing, that smile, not by any means. "Oh," he hissed, the words veritably dripping with venom, "a little fight in ya, eh? I like that. And I'm going to love this." In the time it took for those words to pass between them, for Azula to shudder in fear, Naruto did not attack. Instead, he simply moved. First, much to her infinite dismay, the blonde turned black reared back and spat, launching a scarlet gob of spittle and blood back in Azula's face, blinding her, preventing her from attacking again. In that split second of hesitation as she flailed, he struck again, his forehead slamming hers like a barreling platypus bear, sending several stars of agony, detonating before her sight one by one by one. Even as she struggled to recover, she felt those slim hands wrap round her throat and force her into the murky lake once more. And down we go. Azula barely had to meet a suck in a breath before he shoved her visage into the shallows again. She thrashed and flailed, knowing she was using up her air, but to no avail. Every fiber of her being, her very soul, screamed that he wouldn't let her up for air this time, that he'd Hinesto and I kill her inside his body, and consequences be damned. And she fought, lamenting her inability to prevent her own demise, cursing herself for seeking out this cruel creature, cursing fate for taking her body away and leaving her powerless, but above all, cursing the man known as Uzumaki Naruto. When he let her up for air again, she wanted to weep at her own powerlessness. When she tried to gouge his eyes out, he simply put her under again. He did this time after time, bringing her up, waiting for her to lunge and summarily to allow her a shallow gasp of air, only to push her under for her impudence each time. With each reprimand her strikes grew weaker and weaker, until at last she recognized the futility of her efforts, for the moment. To struggle any further was to risk her own life by drowning. At long last Naruto let her up for air. This time, Azula did not resist. "Are you done?" he asked again. "Yes," she replied meekly. "Good." He grunted and tossed back onto the bank. She didn't even have the strength to make a sound as her body struck the dirt. "Not yet. This is humiliating," Azula said with bleakness in her voice. "First I get banished, then my ship sinks, then I swap bodies with a buffoon, and now this." "Speak for yourself," he shot back. "This body has speed and strength, but no endurance whatsoever." He flexed a wrist for emphasis. "See? Pretty sure I fractured this damn thing hitting you. Not to mention losing a tooth back there. And on top of that, my face is swelling from that kick of yours. Shit, if it weren't for these assets, I'd..." Somehow, Azula almost produced a fireball at that remark. "Careful now," Naruto chortled as he danced away. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Azula snarled, a glimmer of her old self rising to the fore, summoned by his words. "You say that and yet you're the one hurting in the end." If she'd expected to rile him, she would be sorely disappointed. Naruto gave a very unladylike snort and pranced past her, utterly uncaring for the threat his own body posed. "Police." The blackette snorted. "I know for a fact that my body is far more durable than that. You simply lack the will to control it, is all. Give it a day or two, it'll heal right up, you know." "Stop speaking that slang with my mouth." Before she could aim for Naruto, the nimble fighter was already onto her. The first uppercut made her lose her footing, her fist frantically hit nothing but void in the air around her. An elbow then came smashing directly against her face, further destabilizing her as she backed several steps away under the impact. Angered, she wiped away a trickle of blood that was flowing from the corner of her lips as she stared down at Naruto, holding his guard up but with an ironic grin that screamed invitation for more. And more she would give him. Rushing him with a shriek, Azula drew upon all her skill, all she knew of combat. Bending or not, he was just as disadvantaged as she was. If she could just get close. Naruto surprised her then. He stood his ground, features clenched tight in concentration, and thrust a fist outward. Azula didn't slow. There was no way he could bend in her body, just no way. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at sudden attention as the temperature spiked. No. She rolled aside just in time, a split second before a stream of blue fire enveloped where she'd been standing. She gazed at Naruto, baffled. At first he seemed just as surprised as she, but then that shock settled into steely resolve. "Finally," he hissed. "I've figured out how your body works." "What?" Azula never finished that sentence as Naruto struck again, punching the air even as she clambered to her feet. This time there was no thin flickering stream of fire. It was so much more. "That shouldn't be," she faltered, her charge stalling as a massive blast of blue fire erupted into existence, the fireball bearing down on her with ruthless intent. "Too fast. I won't make it in time." Azula threw herself aside, but too little late, she screamed as she rolled aside, the fires glancing her arm before she could to escape. And then it was past, the scorching heat roaring onward, detonating harmlessly in the lake. "Aye, but you how?" Azula spluttered, clutching at her arm. Naruto snickered wordlessly, grinning as he twirled a tongue of blue fire in his palm. "How are you firebending?" "I've had an entire lifetime to study you firebenders, did you really think I wouldn't figure it out once I gained access to Kai?" His grin inexplicably grew. "Now, how did Iroh create lightning?" "Something about separating the Kai and allowing to flow through you, hey?" He laughed, replicating the movements. "My fingers are sparking. I think I've almost got it." "Will you stop it, you're going to fry us." "BZZZZT." The deafening crackle ended her complaint as a stream of black lightning erupted from Naruto's fingertips and scorched a crater between them. Naruto whistled as he beheld his handiwork. "Not bad for my first try." Azula was baffled, how could she be so clumsy in this body while he remained so nimble? Her every skill felt impeded, she couldn't even summon up the rage nor the agility needed to capture him. It was infuriating. As if something were actively blocking her. Impeding her every movement. Almost as if. "Right you are," Naruto replied sagely, as though he'd somehow read her very mind. "I've had someone try to take my body once before, it wasn't entirely pleasant." "Yes siree, when you're as paranoid as I am you learn to place a few limiters on yourself. They were set to trigger in case my spirit ever left my body against its will. All you've access to now is an awkward, uncoordinated shell. Hell, you probably can't even use my chakra. I, on the other hand, find no such block in this body of yours. I'm curious to learn what it's capable of, but I'm kinda focused on this nice body right now. Not to mention the tattoo I gave you earlier." Azula paled. "Tattoo? That's a secret." Naruto cupped her breast for emphasis. "Stop touching them or by an eye, I will burn you to ashes." There was a silence. His lips curled into a smile as he watched her seethe. "Wouldn't you just be burning your own body?" "Arg." 5 minutes of failed attempts later on her part and they were right back where they started, she lay flopped on the bank, only this her right arm his arm was screaming in pain, badly burned at the shoulder. Naruto didn't even bother to help her, though it was technically his body that had been scorched. "What are you waiting for?" Azula cried out, clutching her wound. "Help me. You brought this upon yourself." His visage remained stern. "I may play the prankster, but that doesn't mean I can't be serious." He rose from his crouch and started toward her at a gait. "I've fought worse villains the like of which you'll never know, some I converted, forced them to see the error of their ways. Others well, I'm sure you can guess." He stood over her now, contemplating her in his body. "It would be so easy to finish what I started with you now, don't you think? With this body of yours I could wreak all kinds of havoc." He reached down, cupping her whiskered chin in hand. "So, the question remains, what the devil should I do with you now?" Decisions. "So. What'll it be? Bite me?" "Oh, no." He feigned horror. "Is that your best?" "Ha. Although you should be careful." "Ha." Azula gulped as he moved to straddle her, a look then that sent small shivers shooting down her spine, and not necessarily bad ones. "I'm not above screwing myself, Azula." That sent her face, or was it Naruto's? Gah. Burning brighter than Sozin's comet. How could he be so brazen like that? "Did you think I was serious?" He snickered, pulling away. "But fun and games aside, this is a good chance for the two of us to talk." "Why on earth would I speak to you, Avatar?" The blast of fire scorched the earth mere millimeters from her head. "That's why." Naruto lowered his hand, smiling serenely. Azula weighed her options. With this body in such a sorry state, she really had no way of counteracting her own bending in an way. If she resisted, she was done for. If she stayed her tongue however, she might be able to discover more information on the Avatar and thereby a way to take him down. It galled her to yield like this, but she truly had no choice. "Fine. Good girl." Naruto patted his forehead with a benign palm, but there was a distant misty glint in those eyes as his fingers grazed over her forehead. "I'll be frank with you, princess. It was never my intention to have you banished as you were. Believe what you will, but trust me when I say I know what you're going through." He chuckled bitterly. "It's ironic, isn't it? We both know what it's like to lose everything and be left with nothing." That expression on her face was suddenly dour. Almost somber, even. "I've had to watch as my friend's family, even the land I once dwelled upon, were taken from me, devoured by the progress of time and mankind. Likewise you've had everything taken from you, not by time, but by your royal prick of a father." "You don't know anything about me." Azula hissed. "And my father is a great man. The great flaming asshole is what he is." Naruto snapped back. "I bet he's never once told you he loves you." Her pained expression, however slight, must have given it away, for he smirked. "Didn't think so." And, as to your earlier statement, I know more than you think, girl. You're an open book to me. For starters, you have an inferiority complex because of Ozai, you fear rejection, so you see to control others with fear and intimidation as your sword and shield, never allowing any close enough to care. His fingers brushed her forehead again, and this time Azula could feel him probing within her mind. Was he regaining his strength? Did his power derive from the body, instead of the spirit? If that was the case, she was in dire straits indeed. She bristled as his mind brushed her once again, helpless to do anything but quiver. Socially awkward, too. It seems Mai and Ty Lee are the closest thing to actual friends. Wonder how they feel about you being banished. Azula froze at the mention of her friends in question, a cold hand of fear gripping her heart. The things Naruto might do to them. Stop it. But the Avatar did not stop. Not to mention the whole thing with your mother thinking you're a monster. Stop it. And you're jealous of Zuko because she paid more attention to him. Wow. But in any case, that's why. I told you to stop. Azula begged with tears in her eyes. She didn't think she could take any more of this. I'd like you to join us. Naruto finished. Subsequently, the silence was deafening. Join you? Did I stutter? Golden eyes flashed in warning, and once more Azula found herself cowed. Even in her own body, the blonde knew how to put her in place. Not just as a firebender, but as a person, I think you would be a fine addition to the team. Besides, for all our disagreements, we're more alike than you'd care to admit. You're not pure evil. Just misunderstood. It might be the old me speaking here, but I still think there may be hope for you, yet he blanched at her unreadable expression. A slim hope, but still. Azula actually flushed. Why? Why are you being so kind to me? Naruto chuckled, coming from Azula's mouth, it sounded oddly girlish. I told you, there's potential in you. You could do great things for this world with your power and influence. Wonderful things. At that, his visage took on a contemplative expression. Let's say for example, once I've beat and butchered your father, you became the next Fire Lord. Say you actually ruled with a steady hand. Of course, you'd have to overcome your complex first. The fire, she began. Also your fault. I know. Azula snapped back. I'm sorry. Forget I said anything. Just shut up. Once you've considered my offer, I will. For a moment, Azula actually considered it. She recalled Uzumaki Naruto defeating her so effortless back on Kyoshi, ending her life only to revive her again. Maybe you'll come back as a different person. The Avatar had spoke softly to her then, those words a gentle trickle of compassion so different from the rapidity of hatred and fear she had encountered all her life. Just now, he'd spoken to her the same way. She hung her head at these words, trying to decipher the feelings churning through her chest. I've really lost, haven't I? She could feel the immediate and familiar rise of contempt for her opponent at the mere concept of this Avatar pitying her. Azula could also sense the rusty emotion of respect for Naruto, for this fighter who was fueled by love rather than rage. And, almost completely eclipsed by these two other emotions, Azula could feel the longing for a companion, for someone to talk to, for someone to help her off the ground when she's down. Where's the happiness in that? Perhaps for someone to love her, even when she fails. Like hell. The sudden realization that she was even considering herself weak brought a wave of rage to her mind, with the ferocity of a great and dark tempest. Despite her opponent's mercy towards him, Naruto looking down in her eyes, pleading for him to stop, the anger won over Azula, and she yanked her arm out of the Avatar's gentle grip. Don't you fuck with me, you bastard. She roared, swarming up against him with her good arm, her fingers finding his throat. You took everything from me. I'll never work with you. I'd sooner see you dead. Is that so? For a genuine moment, the Avatar actually seemed sad. Well then, if you insist on being uncooperative, I suppose I'll have to eliminate you for good this time. It took everything she had not to scream as he ignited his foremost finger and pushed it to her forehead, the heat of that lone fingertip sizzling into her flesh. Odd. Why were his fingers glow? Bing. Naruto cringed as the world between him and Azula blurred once more, boundaries his vision doing a 180. Instead of standing he found himself on the ground, eyes rolling back in his head, wincing as pain flooded his body and soul. His mind brushed against Azula's for a terrifying instant. All her anger, fear and hatred were communicated to him in that instant. And then, as swiftly and inexplicably as it had begun, their brief union was done. Naruto found himself peering up at Azula, and she down at him, each torn between confusion and exultation. Somehow, someway, they were back in their bodies again. He himself nearly laughed, all the while fighting the urge to scream as his wounds made themselves evident. His body remained covered in small burns, but it was his shoulder that ached the worst, the charred flesh protesting to even the slightest rise and fall of his chest. Ah, crap. He silently swore as he rolled his aching joint in its socket. It wouldn't heal until tomorrow at the earliest, but now, it was only a liability to him. He could feel it healing, but much too slowly. Well. Naruto coughed up at her. Looks like the tables have turned. Indeed they have. Azula's smile ranked right up there with his top 3 fears, superseded only by the terror of all things ghostly and a world without Ramen. Such a shame. A few more minutes and you might have had me there. Despite himself, Naruto feigned a smile at those words. In his present state, she might actually be able to capture him or worse, end him right here and now. But his hand was still on her throat, something a veteran like Azula should have noticed. And yet she hadn't. It would be so easy just to snap her neck and be done with it. As such, it came as a complete surprise when she jerked her head around and bit him. Bit him. Naruto blinked in surprise, recoiled from the unexpected move. Don't worry, Azula purred, I'm not going to kill you. First, I'm going to make you suffer. Starting with those hussies you hold so dear. Naruto snorted. Those hussies could kick your ass 7 ways to Sunday. His gaze suddenly hardened. And, on the off chance you did harm them I'd kill you. I don't take kindly to those who threaten my precious people, you too well. I won't hurt you unless you make it necessary. She tilted her head to the side in question. Will it be necessary? Probably. Before she could level a retort of her own, the blonde levered himself upward on his good arm and spun with his feet, striking not at Azula, but at everything around her. The blast was nothing short of spectacular, currents of wind chakra erupting from his legs, windmilling, forcing Azula to take a step backwards as a current of wind chakra propelling him bodily backwards towards the lake. Even as he flew he righted himself, pouring chakra into the soles of his boots, gaining traction where there was none to be found. There was distance between them now, and distance was all he needed. Thank Kami he'd mastered one-handed seals all those years ago. I never thought I'd be more grateful to Haku. Besides. I can't die here. Something strange happened then. His charged shoulder, the one he was certain he'd never regain full functionality with, began to heal. It rapidly mended before his eyes, burned flesh stitched itself back together in an instant, all the burns his body had accumulated disappearing in the blink of an eye. Both blonde and Blackette blinked, baffled by this turnaround. Huh. Naruto flexed his newly healed limb. Looks like my regeneration isn't ready to quit on me just yet, after all. Which means. Azula blanched. Can't we talk about this? No. Naruto's golden aura leapt back to life, his cloak larger and more intense than ever. The rapidly darkening skies lit up with the unearthly light, this golden radiance trembling at the return of the Avatar. An Avatar of the gods. The next thing Azula knew, she was flying back, her face now adorned by something best described as a dent in her cheeks. The next thing she knew, she was knocked upwards. A blinking gold light was growing larger at the end of his vision. The next, she was knocked back down. And the next thing Azula knew, for quite some time after that, was pain. Did you hear something? Hear what? Suki perked up, her attention drawn not by Katara's voice, by the sound of a thunderclap in the distance. Naruto had been gone for several hours now and in that time, much had occurred. The village they had taken refuge in had been attacked by a spirit, Sokka and Haru had been kidnapped by said spirit, forcing Aang to go after them, only to vanish into the forest, never to return. The sky had grown horribly dark since then, and although morning was fast approaching, no sign of the sun could be seen. Spirits, where were they? Hear what? That. The waterbender turned her gaze toward the skies as thunder roared through the heavens. Suki flinched as a dull rumble rippled through the earth, evidently Naruto's battle with Azula had resumed in earnest or worse, for them to feel the effects of their battle even from here was truly a feat of wonder. Momo cringed, whimpering as lightning split the sky. Appa covered his head with a paw. Katara sympathized. The fear she felt was not just for herself, but for that of Naruto as well, if not Morrison. She knew he was capable of world-shattering feats, and yet if this continued. I hope he's alright. Azula reeled from yet another impossibly strong blow. She's lost count. Her opponent was an unstoppable force of nature, it seemed, and defeat was growing near. To think he'd been holding back this entire time. But no longer, she realized, as another blow dropped her into the earth, only for a second to launch her into the skies moments later. A third sent her body caroming off the soil, once again mercifully putting her body out of range from the deadly and almost unseen strikes. Yes, she was back in her body, for all the good it had done her. Naruto was dominating her, proving his superiority once more. Kami, to think she almost missed having him in her Christakami Outsurong. Why are you standing there? Naruto called down to her, striding down upon the air itself. Aren't you going to fight back? Azula scrambled away, putting some distance between herself and this impossible fighter. Yushi stared at Naruto's defiant figure, almost unable to believe what she'd been put through because of this one simple avatar, this mere man. I will not stand for this. Dude bad. Naruto's voice whispered in her ear when had he gotten behind her. Causing the princess to start in surprise. You don't get a say, not anymore. Akram. Her face kissed the soil that had bruised with enough force to make her bounce. Before she could recover, Naruto was there, trapping her in a prison of earth, binding her arms and legs before could even think to fling both at him and escape. Congratulations, you're my prisoner at the moment. Now, I'm going to present you with one of two choices. He said slowly. Join us, or die. For good this time. For emphasis he held up a hand, revealing a small yet rapidly growing Rasen shuriken held in his palm. Azula bristled at the sight of that technique, trying to skitter backwards despite her bonds and failing miserably. It swelled with each passing second, rapidly expanding the keening shriek of its hour note, threatening to drown out everything else and end her life. Well? Naruto asked. What's it going to be? Several minutes later. Naruto. The mismatched blonde turned as he strode into the village, Azula slung over his shoulder like a rag doll. Not quite the way he'd intended to introduce her to the group, but it'd have to do. Now he paused at the sound of Suki's voice. Mere seconds later the Kyoshi warrior slammed into him, nearly bowling the blonde over, causing him to drop his charge in favor of embracing his assailant. Slender arms wrapped round his chest and drew him to her face all but buried in his burnt shirt. Any attempt to extricate himself proved pointless, she simply moved with him. Hey. Naruto grunted his surprise and managed to wriggle his way free and hold her at arm's length. I'm fine, Suki. Were you crying? Had she been wearing her warrior makeup, it would have been horribly smudged by now. As it were, those hazel orbs remained red and puffy, the poor thing looked as though she'd been bawling her eyes out. You know I'm perfectly fine, MMMPH. His mind exploded into wide as her mouth struck his, her lips connecting with a suddenness he hadn't expected. It was his first kiss in over a century. His eyes shot open in surprise, her kiss was cool but gentle, her two lips caging his upper lip between them. Part of him wanted to balk, to ask why she was doing this, but he was completely overwhelmed by her as she released her wrist and cupped his cheek with her hand. He soon found himself returning the kiss, deepening it as she opened her mouth and slid her tongue out and against his. She reached upwards with her arms and wrapped them around his neck, a soft whimper fleeing their coupled mouths as he pulled her body closer to his. How long had it been since he'd felt this? A part of him knew it was foolish to have feelings for a teenager, especially when he himself had lived for hundreds of years, but he found it impossible to resist, his arms taking matters into their own hands, refusing to relinquish their hold upon the young maiden before him. What was it about her that attracted him so? There were no words, nothing to explain how he felt, how his heart all but soared in his chest from their lip lock. It was like having something live for again, no longer would he shuffle from place to place while wearing the mask of jester. Now he actually had something to fight for, something. For a moment it was just that, just the two of them. Just. Ahem. At the sound of Katara's voice, Suki jerked back as if she'd been burned. Sorry, she whispered, her lips leaving his, but refusing to release his arms. Don't be. Naruto replied, catching the slight shiver his words elicited in her. I thought you were. She's been like that ever since you left. Katara said, coming up beside him. Thankfully she made no move to embrace him, contenting herself to a slight smile at his return. Good to have you back. But there was a touch of steel in her eyes, a quiet anger he'd come to know all too well. He'd have some explaining to do. But for now, he offered a grin of his own, relieved to find his charges unharmed. But where have you been? Naruto explained what had happened at length, careful to omit the interesting parts as he informed his students of what had occurred. Seriously, Suki balked. You guys swapped. I thought that only happened in cartoons. Suki, this is a cartoon. What? No, it isn't. Actually. If the two of you are quite done breaking the fourth wall, Katara interrupted, her gaze straying to the prone princess, what is she doing here? She's going to teach Aang firebending. Naruto replied simply. Their combined deadpan was barely concealed, momentarily united by their shared confusion. What? Azula groaned at that, stirring from her slumber at last. She's awake. Naruto commented mildly. Good. This makes things easier. He trailed off as Azula bolted to her feet and shoved a finger in his face. Katara and Suki bristled, well aware she could easily blow his head off with lightning, but Naruto didn't so much as bat an eyelash. Did you want something? The blonde blinked. Azula growled. Listen, Avatar. I can join your group or I can do something unspeakably horrible to you and your friends. Your choice. Coming from her mouth those words sounded quite strange. Most strange indeed. She was likely trying to save face in front of Katara and Suki, but when faced with such a threat, he simply burst out laughing. What's so funny? Naruto managed to explain between bouts of delirious snickering. You really need to work on your people skills, Azula. A final chuckle and he straightened, his blue eyes adopting a semi-serious expression. And besides, you're asking the wrong person. The ex-princess offered a soft sound that only made re-expression even more priceless. You mean you're not the Avatar? An Avatar, yes. But the Avatar? Naruto grinned as he revealed the ruse. Nope. But thanks for joining us. The slow coloring of Azula's face was possibly the most priceless thing in the world. You damn cheeky. Speaking of cheeky, where's Ong? Naruto frowned. I haven't seen him. Or Sokka. Or Haru. Katara told him. The spirit? Seriously? Well yes. This is why I don't leave you guys alone. Never again. There is a reason I don't enjoy traveling to the spirit world, as it turns out, I'm not entirely welcome there. I've even gotten trapped in spirit form once or twice before. Not a pleasant thing. I don't know why it seems to happen, only that it does. Perhaps I've upset the natural balance, the order, somehow by being reborn so many times. Perhaps the spirits regard me as an abomination for my inability to truly stay dead. Perhaps I'm just not a very sociable person. It could be any number of things. Who knows? Anyway, I managed to get the boys back in record time, too. And Ong managed to calm Haibai down. One Mokuten jutsu later and the woods were as good as new. This time with no crazy fire lady to burn them down around my ears, thank you very much. Which brings me to this next entry in my diary. Azula. Not quite sure what to do with her. But I just couldn't leave her alone. She's got nothing now, you know. I'm really bringing her with us on a whim, with only her word that she won't betray us at the first opportunity. I think it would be remiss of me to ignore her, though. I too know what it is like to have lost everything. But as fate would have it, we're not done yet. Harem might have decided to stay here and help the villagers protect their new forest, but an avatar's work is never done. Apparently one of Ong's past lives needs him to reach a temple before the solstice. Tomorrow. Not much of a problem when you can fly, right? Wrong. Did I mention this temple was in the Fire Nation? No. Because it's. That's right. The Fire Nation. The one who wants us dead. Yeah. That one. Man, this had better not come back to bite me in the ass. What you reading? Yep. Azula gave a very unladylike squeak as Naruto's head popped up over her shoulder and took up residence there, an arm curling around her waist, to draw her close. She froze, transfixed as his body pressed up against hers, those rimmed blue eyes holding her, rooting her in place. She almost didn't notice it when he calmly reached around her with the other hand and plucked his diary from her grasp. She didn't even have the gall to resist, not with the business end of a kunai sticking threateningly between her ribs. It was like being a powerless child all over again, forced to obey as he stood over her in the moonlight. Her only solace was that the others had since fallen asleep, leaving her to suffer this indignity alone. Well, not entirely alone. It's not nice to steal, Azula. He purred, his lips brushing the outer lobe of her ear in passing. I just might have to punish you for this. Was it wrong for her to be more aroused than she had ever been around him? The spike of fear and threat of pain had her readying a fireball, but only for the first fraction of a second. It gradually passed when that bemused voice ingrained in her heart started to laugh, his mirth flowing like dark velvet through her ears, instantly tuning her into the identity of her attacker. And sending her fantasies into hyperdrive. Pain, by itself, was not something she feared, it was the pain of humiliation so readily inflicted by the bedeviled blonde that sent her heart rate skyrocketing. Once again, her visage outshone Sozin's comet. You that is. And now that I've stolen this back, he gave the book a wag before returning it to his pocket, I think it's time we set some ground rules, you and I. You may be traveling with us now, but I need to know that you won't strike at me the moment I turn my back. Or Ong's, for that matter. She paled at that insinuation. I said I wouldn't. You may say that to me now, Naruto shot back with a stern scowl, his sapphire eyes searching her saffron scathingly. But, what if things were different? What if your father offered you amnesty? What if he suddenly decides to, say, welcome you back with open arms? When she opened her mouth to rebuke the likelihoods of such a thing, he cut her off with an angry grunt. And all you had to do was put a dagger in my back while I was asleep. Are you saying you wouldn't even consider it? Azula tried to turn her head away, but Naruto's hand was suddenly there forcing her gaze back to him. Don't try and lie to me. You would be tempted. And I wouldn't blame you. Power can be a seductive lure, my best friend once fell to it before my very eyes. No, before we go any further, I'm going to have you take the oath. Oath? Something deep within the princess quailed at that word. She didn't like the sound of it. It's something a Kage took in service to his or her feudal lord in Konoha, and beyond his smile was genial, but the words within hinted at something more. Ah. You look confused, my dear. Have I said something to upset you? Azula gaped at him there, blinking rapidly. At length, she smoothed the wrinkles in her gown and compassed herself enough to speak. I've never heard of Konoha. She said. I'd be surprised if you had. Naruto sounded 1,000 years older just then, wiser beyond the teenage shell with whom she spoke. No, he continued with a shake of the head, Konoha doesn't exist in any of these 4 nations that you call home. Nor, for that matter, do I hail from any of them in these parts. To be precise, at her puzzled frown he continued, I come from a land beyond the horizon. That's not possible. There is no land beyond our own. You make it sound as if there's an entire continent. Absurd. The reply was out of her mouth and into the night before she could think to take it back. But instead of an angry rebuke, she only received a sly smile. Naruto reached forward, flicking her on the forehead. Ow. Is that what they teach youngjins these days? He reprimanded her light. Tell me then, if I'm not from beyond the sea, then where do you think I'm from? I'm too resolutous to be from the water tribe, and as you can see, I don't exactly share the fashion sense of their people. I can't be from the air nomads, Ong's the last of them. I could be from the earth kingdoms given my complexion, but what would I be doing this far west? And I'm certainly not from the fire nation as you can already see. If I was, I'd have you bent over my knee for addressing me like that. It was a fair sight to watch her cheeks color like that, he thought. Well worth revealing his past, at any rate. I forget you're not familiar with my country. Naruto chuckled and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes lit with warmth. Then were cold again, like the stones at their feet. Let me give you a brief explanation of my world, just to whet your appetite. A feudal lord rules a country. But what ruler can control his kingdom without an army? The shinobi were that army, in a sense. Oh, the feudal lord may have had his samurai, but it was we who did the dirty work those honorable warriors wouldn't dare sully their hands with. Seduction. Assassination. Poisoning. Bombings. His tone rose with each word until they were almost thick with emotions, his eyes turning inward and distant as he pressed on. It as if he were there, she thought, recalling the days of a distant summer. Azula continued to listen, a small part of her rapidly becoming enraptured by the tale. She'd never heard of other lands on the horizon, now to actually be told of them. And still, Naruto continued. We struck from the shadows, bringing death to our lord's enemies for whatever we were called. At that time, the highest rank a shinobi could attain was that of Kage, or Shadow, the leader of the village in which the ninja of his dominion dwelt. Naturally, the Kage also served the daimyo, for without their funding, the village and all those who inhabited it would essentially die without it. In the beginning of the shinobi era, to ensure their loyalty to one another, and I won't bore you with their specifics, an oath was enacted, a sacred ritual that was nothing of sort binding to both parties involved. It was discontinued by my time, and I only learned of it some years ago before my situation. He summed up his tale with a smile. I can think of nothing better to ensure we don't kill one another. Azula scowled, a touch of her old haughtiness creeping back into her expression. And I should agree to this, why? Because. Something in his sight hardened then, those cobalt blue eyes becoming more akin to the violent violet she so feared. Just looking at those eyes reminded her of how he'd played pinball with her body in the air, batting her back and forth as though she were no more than a child's ball. But it was what he said next, those chilling words, that truly dropped her heart into the pit of her stomach. Because, he continued, if you refuse to take the oath, I'll have to kill you. Right here. Right now. Banished or not, I can't risk you coming after me and my charges again. So choose. Will you live and swear yourself to my service to make a better person of yourself? Or will you die, another body heaped on my already overburdened conscience? The choice is yours. He folded both arms before his broad chest, all traces of humor devoid from the icy blue pools that were his eyes. Now, choose. The light rains had all but completely stopped and they were presented with the infinite brilliance of the full moon because the clouds themselves were fleeing as though they'd been swept aside by the hand of a giant. Azula wanted to utter a string of long and lengthy lamentations as he glared toward the inert shinobi who'd supposedly triggered it. She had the feeling he was trying to be overly dramatic, that or nature itself really did fear him. Instead she stood there, riveted. Rooted to the spot. Bound. Unable to move. Naruto would do it, she realized. He had no compunctions about killing. If she'd any doubt about his abilities, then their fight had put those to rest. Along with her pride. She would be the first to admit that notion had been a touch too tempting when he'd enlightened her to it. Their idea of returning home to the life of royalty that she'd always known might not be so bad in lieu of one on the run. But a thorn of anger pricked her and held her back. Father had discarded her. Yes, he might welcome her back, but if he had already cast her out once, who was to say he wouldn't do it again the moment she displeased him? No. She catered to no one's whims. Except maybe. Those of the enigmatic blonde standing before her. From what she'd seen of his abilities thus far, he could probably obliterate most skilled benders, I included, with a single swing of his hand. And yet he didn't. He was biding all his time, holding back for something. Waiting. But for what? Whatever it was, she was certain that she wanted to be by his side to see it happen. Just as she was certain his enemies would burn when all was said and done. And if the Fire Lord were to die during the conflict, then surely someone would need to step in and replace him. Not that dolt Zuzu of course. And certainly not their fuddy-duddy of an Uncle Iroh. Yes, it certainly helped she was already inclined towards taking vengeance on her father, but really, what other choice did she have? The only way she could see any of those things through was if she lived. Life. I'll take the former, thank you. She said at last. She could only. Very good. Before she could think to stop him, he had a knife in his hand. Even as she recoiled, thinking it a betrayal, he slashed down on his arm, drawing blood in a spurt of red. Despite their dislike for one another, Azula actually gasped when he slit his wrist. Was he insane? Did he want to die? She stared agape, hopelessly baffled. And yet he seemed so at ease, calm and unperturbed, despite the fact his lifeblood was essentially draining away right before their very eyes. Stop balking. He chided angrily, snapping her out of her daze, and give me your arm. Again he moved faster than Azula could hope to think. Warm fingers wrapping around her wrist, taking hold of her small arm and tugging it toward him. She hissed when he made a small incision of his own, only to flush horribly as he laid his lips against it and licked. What sorcery was this? An ecstatic tingle raced up her back, threads of warmth gathering and spooling in a very uncomfortable place she'd rather not think about. Naruto wasn't a vampire, this was just some obscene ritual of his to ensure they didn't kill each other, and oh my dear, would it feel so good. Your turn. Wah? Shamefaced, she realized Naruto had stopped, he was now in the process of cleaning his lips. I said it's your turn. He held out his arm to her. Hurry before the wound closes. Alright. Blushing, she did as she was asked. The feeling that shot through her was like one of molten lava, just a taste, but one enough to warm her veins anew. No other word could describe it. Instead of the coppery taste she had since come to associate with her own blood, it tasted different somehow. Strong. Powerful. Light and airy, yet incredibly stern as well. Feelings unknown welled up within her as she held her lips to the injury, the tiniest of euphoria filling her. My blood is your blood. My arm is thine arm. My blade, your blade. My flame, your flame. Naruto recited. A faint numbness came over her as he spoke the words. This is the oath of our pact. We will not harm one another so long as we live, will not draw blood unto the pain of death. This is our pact. And then he was done, stripping a portion of his sleeve away to bind her cut. That was oddly specific. She pulled away, cringing slightly when he pulled the fabric taut. Hey, I don't choose the words. Naruto shrugged, cleaning their wounds. You should be lucky I even knew of this ritual. If I didn't, I would have dumped your body in a ditch the moment we switched back. The way he said it so nonchalantly was enough to send fingers of ice brushing down her spine. She had the distinct feeling she didn't know anything about this young man that he didn't want her to know, and to be honest, that frightened her. Terribly so. And yet in the same vein it also attracted her. Uzumaki Naruto. Such a conundrum. And now that we've finished that, he leaned in, smirking. Her heart quickened. I can. You can't, she gasped, breathless. I can finally tell you about the tattoo I gave you. Just like that he leaned away, smirking at having gotten her so hot and bothered. Tattoo? Yup. Enjoy. Azula paled, whipping around as the blonde vanished in a swirl of leaves. All that was left was a mirror. Dreading what she might find, the ex-princess picked it up and tilted it, lifting the hem of her gown as she did so, determined to see what he had row. That was when she finally caught sight of Naruto's tattoo he'd left during his stay in her body. There, on her left ass cheek, carved by fire, a word. Juicy? I will burn you. Ah, she's just so easy to mess with. Ended up catching up on some sleep after that. Put a seal on my diary, just in case. It would have been problematic if she'd learned that I impersonated her before the oath. Really glad she didn't learn that. I've enough problems without little Miss Attitude trying to burn a hole in the seat of my pants. I get the feeling there'll be more than enough of that once we reach this fire temple thingy. Really, I find the idea of having former lives fine and all, but what the point of having so many if you can't just commune with them on the spot? Seriously? I've lived more than my fair share and I remember all of them just fine. The last thing I need is to be dragged to some god-forsaken temple. I mean, really. It makes me wonder what I was thinking way back when, waiting for the Avatar to do something. Was I foolish to let it drag on this long? Could I have done something? Maybe but I digress. We're making relatively good time on Appa here, despite the cold shoulder everyone seems to be giving Azula. Even Suki's upset about it, leaving Haru with those villagers even, though he asked to stay and protect them and taking on a dangerous firebender instead. They have every right to be wary, I suppose. Not that it'll matter, soon. I have plans of my own pretty soon. Ozai's going to be feeling a burn of his own. Speaking of burning, is it getting hot in here? Ah crap. Fireball. Naruto bit out a sigh and reluctantly set down his journal as another flaming ball of doom came hurtling out at them from behind, intent on swatting Appa from the sky once and for all. Ong's call had alerted him to the offending item, but even so he couldn't help but wonder why the boy hadn't dealt with it himself. No matter. An errant flick of the wrist was all it took to send the putrid projectile hurtling back from whence it came, the slightest application of Shinra Tensei violently rebounding it at the pursuing vessel. The sickening crunch of fire meeting steel was most satisfactory, but even then their hunter didn't slow in the slightest. Zuko. Odd, he had to give the boy credit where it was due, he was remarkably persistent. He probably wouldn't be flinging those fireballs if he knew his little sister was up here with the Avatar, but Naruto wasn't inclined to tip that part of his hand yet. It was crucial to his plans that Ozai's oldest sibling didn't realize just how deep Azula was in until they reached the temple. He felt bad about breaking the boy's mind really, but he didn't see any other way to snap poor Zuko out of the inkling that his honor hinged on capturing the Avatar. You made your own honor. But that thought firmly locked within his mind, Naruto unslung his sword from his back standing tall in the saddle, just as another blazing ball of death came roaring down on them. Kubikira Haucho screamed forward with a sibilant hiss, meeting the onrushing meteor and bisecting its smoldering surface, the blazing sphere of heat effortlessly, sending the severed halves tumbling away into the ocean. Since when can you do that? Sokka exclaimed, staring at the smoldering sword. Since always. Naruto barked back. Ah Naruto. Suki's voice called him from the saddle. Kinda busy. Another swing, another fizzled fireball. It's important. Ong called. God-damned arrowhead, what could be so? The words died as Katara jerked him around to see what all the fuss was about. Oh. Blockade. That was his first thought as he saw the fleet of ships lying in wait. Of course there would be a blockade. They were headed into the Fire Nation, after all. He would have been surprised if they hadn't had one. Ozai was the paranoid sort, after all. Most Fire Lords were of the emotional sort, either so absorbed in their power that they wouldn't even consider an attack against their person or so fearful that they would swarm their own border with so many ships that you'd have to be suicidal to make an attempt on them. But there were way too many of those. You'd have to be insane to take on a fleet like that. Thankfully, Naruto wasn't exactly sane. Yup, he decided, I think it's about that time. I can probably buy them a few hours if I use that. Think you can handle your big brother if he catches up? He asked of Azula. I can handle Zuzu, thank you very much. She sniffed, indignant. Then she frowned. But what are you? Naruto's only response was to smile. Then his lips claimed hers in a brief, scorching kiss. Katara and Suki colored. Ong and Sokka gawped. But absolutely none were as red as poor Azula. Inwardly screaming in both rage and delight, relishing the harsh movements that just barely walked the fence between force and violence, it was all she could do to gasp out a breath as he stepped away. Ayu, what was that for? For good luck, what else? Cackling, the Avatar of the gods shouldered his brutal blade and stepped backwards off the bison, submitting to the wild winds raging around them. Go on ahead. I'll see you guys in a few weeks. Again, the looks on their faces. He wouldn't have traded it for anything else in the world. Ah, priceless. The effect was almost immediate, gravity hooked its claws into him and he dropped, sinking like a stone. Naruto gave himself to the momentum, shooting downward feet first. A man-made comet in all its fiery and fury, he offered no resistance to the forces tugging at him, instead shooting downward as a spear from on high. Within moments, he was lost to the sight of his fellows. And as he fell he let go, releasing all restraints locked upon his power, his body violently tearing itself apart as the energies trapped within came roaring back out. It was horrible. Horrifying. Blue eyes flashed black, his skin boiling in unhealthy ebony. It was something he rarely used, something that forced him to discard all restraint, all remorse. His own Avatar state. He's insane. Azula cried, peering over the rim of the saddle, struggling to see the still streaking fireball that was her partner. There's no way he'll survive the landing. Suki simply yawned. 3. 2. Katara continued blithely. 1. Azula blinked, baffled by the countdown. A resounding bang signaled Naruto's arrival in the blockade. Is he supposed to be glowing? Ong asked. 5 heads poked out over the saddle, 6 if one counted a certain lemur gawping, as a small tornado took up residence on the deck of the foremost ship. Then steel started flying. No, that's definitely new. Zhao was staring at a hurricane given flesh and form. Though there was no wind, something was taking shape within the crater that had been the bow, black specks obscuring and spinning at a dizzying pace to the height of 6 tornado glowed an iridescent scintillating shade of shot out and danced across the deck, and men cried out. The commander all but froze, his smugly satisfied smile slowly slipping away from him and into the daylight as a strange and haunting tune began to fill the air, further perpetuating this strange phenomena. A voice like thunder in the heavens shook them to their very bones, rattled them to their souls. Madness is a funny thing. Taking shape through the tornado was a man, or something like a man. The figure flashed blue, spraying light in every direction, and not even Zhao was fast enough to cover his eyes. When he looked again, when he dared to open his eyes, a figure unlike any he had ever seen stood between him and the Kunoichi, cowering wide-eyed in the grass. The man's body appeared to be carved from glossy red and black marble, or shaped from liquid metal, save for the large cleaver-like blade cloth draped around his back. All you need. The man blinked rapidly, clambering away from the creature taking shape. 3 arms of glistening ebony extended outward on either side to make 6 in total, those rippling limbs glistening with untold power, untapped energies just waiting, begging to be unleashed upon the world once more. As a little push. Zhao swallowed once, one thought leaping to his mind as the creature stood woodenly. What is that? His clothes weren't so much clothes as skin, though he appeared to wear shoes and was sexless. His whole body was unrelieved black, and every contour was crisply defined. He was lean and every muscle was etched, from his shoulders to his V of the chest to his stomach to his legs. There was something wrong about his skin, though. At first, the man or demon or statue made of flesh had reflected light like burnished steel. Now only parts of him gleamed, the crescents of his biceps, the horizontal slashes of his abdominal muscles. The rest of him faded from glossy black to faded scarlet whenever the shadows touched his being. Its head beeped no more than 5 degrees to the east, tilting almost in consideration for the maggot standing before it. Then it grinned. Time for a push, boys. Everything was suddenly a bloody blur, men and women were dying, fireballs were flying, and everything stood in complete chaos. And throughout it all, the god demon stood unharmed. It laughed and made a swiping motion with one of its many hands, unseen punches pummeling through the deck to pound soldiers into a pasty pulp. It swung about, crushing the blockade with invisible pushes, sending the ships plummeting to death in the waters, sinking to the briny abyss with their crew and all. He was death given form. Throughout it all, Zhao could only watch, in powerless horror. The creature cackled, tossing his sword forwards. Zhao scrambled backwards like a drunken crab, barely avoiding decapitation at the hands of the massive cleaver, cringing as the spinning blade plowed after him. It sank into the steel less than an inch from his head, splitting the hull in twine. And then inexplicably he did the unthinkable. The eerie creature that Naruto had become suddenly faded, leaving him whole and human once more. He raised his hands. I surrender. What? The shout could be heard halfway around the world. Appa, now too far away to make his own roar of confusion heard, simply brayed in distress. For all the time that Naruto had bought them, they'd expected him to at the very least, rejoin them once they'd gotten past the blockade. Instead, they found him surrendering, with only his promise of seeing them again soon to comfort them. Azula wanted nothing more than to turn around and wring his neck for doing such a thing, but pressed for time as they were, they could only press onward. Still, everyone wondered. What the hell was Naruto thinking? Admiral Zhao could scarcely contain himself. He would be a legend for this day. He'd done it. Captured him. The Avatar. He'd been a touch worried when the boy had become that thing, but now it was over. He enjoyed every moment of slapping him in chains and tossing him into the brig, careful to shackle every part of his body. Wouldn't do for him to escape, after all. So here he is, he sneered, the words addressed to the prone form before him. Funny, I expected you to be older. Really? Much to his complete confusion, the young man actually sighed at those words, as though this entire ordeal were nothing more than a mere distraction on the road of life for him. I mean, really? That's it, huh? That's all you've got to say? I mean, I didn't expect much out of a thug like yourself, but damn. He shook his head, chuckling quietly, snickering in the face of the man's growing wrath. Why is it that the villain always has to have such cliched lines? Heaven forbid you'd have something, I don't know, interesting to say, considering you've got the pinnacle of godhood chained up in your basement. It doesn't matter who or what you say you are. Zhao sniffed. In his mind's eye, if this boy wasn't going to fear him, then there was no point in this fruitless intimidation. You are now my prisoner, the Fire Lord will be most pleased when I bring him the Avatar in chains. You would have been wiser to fight to the death rather than surrender. Even here in Chain's grasp, this deadpan was barely concealed. So then you must be the asshole in charge of pursuing me and my friends, Zhao, right. Unbidden he smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing, that old smile of his. Many thanks. You gave me the chance I needed to slip away. So, I'm gonna be merciful. I won't break you like the others. I'll just kill you. Kill me? Zhao scoffed, though he did take a swift step backwards. You fool. You're bound and in chains. Even if you could escape I would never ye-erg. Those words trailed off into a girlish squeal as a boot unerringly roared out of the steel to plant itself between his legs. Even as the world reeled around him, a hand found his face and another, his neck. Then they began to twist, forcing the man's head at a hideously awkward angle. The last sound he heard was that of his own vertebrae snapping like so many twigs, then nothingness. His last sight was that of this captive towering over him, boot pressing down. Crunch. Naruto stood over him, grinning like the devil himself. You were saying something, shithead. When Zhao's corpse didn't respond, he snickered. Oh no, he soothed. Don't get up on my account. I'll just be taking your ship for little joyride. You don't mind, do you? Cloaked, he stalked up to the deck. The guards and the crew never saw what killed them, even the helmsman only felt the knife after it had slit his throat. There was a reason he'd surrendered, after all. He needed at least one fully functional vessel to carry out his mission. A mission that began now. Smiling, Naruto took the wheel and gave it a hard turn. Sorry kids, he cast a wanton gaze to the skies, gazing wantonly at Appa's retreating form. You're going to be on your own for a little bit. Cracking his knuckles, he turned his attention to the helm. It pained him to leave his family behind, no matter how brief their separation might be, but preparations needed to be made. With Zhao firmly out of the way and whatever plans he'd made disrupted, he had every confidence that his disciples would be perfectly safe while he was gone. Zuko was no real threat to them. No, now he could begin the first phase of his plan, a plan to bring down the Fire Lord in the only way he knew how. Painfully. I've got some work to do. End chapter. So this part ends here. If you want to see next part of this series, like the video now and share the story with your friends. Bye bye.